apparently, Himmler bellowed down the phone from Berlin to Stroop saying, "You must at all costs bring down those two flags." So the significance of the flags was certainly not lost on the enemy. 1993, a Polish woman who had lived on that square outside the ghetto, opposite the Zed ZedW headquarters, because that was their headquarters, by the way. We're talking about the building that was held by the Zed ZedW. She published a book called At the Gates of Hell, in which she describes the flags the Zed ZedW had raised over the ghetto. This is an eyewitness, a Polish woman, not Jewish, who literally her home was there in the square. On the roof opposite, we could see people coming and going, and we could see that each of them was armed with some kind of weapon. At one moment, we witnessed an exceptional sight on that roof. A blue and white flag and a red and white flag were raised. We all cheered. "Look, look, the Jewish flag! The Jews have taken Maranowska Square." Our voices echoed on the stairs. We hugged each other, hugged and kissed. I'd like to be able to tell you that this reaction was a general reaction in Warsaw, but I can't. Anyway, armed with rifles, submachine guns, machine guns, and Molotov cocktails, the Zed ZedW fighters established fortified positions and succeeded in holding up the advance of the German forces during an entire day's fighting. As I said, the Germans could not take it, they retreated, and only the next day did they come with much larger forces. Of course, when they came back, the Nazi forces came back with much more firepower. Stroop's object was to raze the ghetto to the ground, building by building, and although Jewish resistance fighters made sporadic raids from their bunkers, eventually, as we know, the Germans reduced the ghetto to rubble. If you look at any photo of the ghetto as the Germans finished, it looks eerily like Hiroshima. Like literally flat land with maybe one stump of a building still standing. As anyone who knows the official history of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising knows, Mordechai Nilevich and those with him were killed in the attack on Mila 18 of the ZOB command bunker. It fell on May the 8th. As manpower, ammunition, space and time steadily diminished, fighting became sporadic. A handful of Jewish fighters and civilians managed to escape to the ghetto and find shelter outside. The vast majority of the fighters were killed and the non-fighters taken away, so their death was delayed by a few more days. When it was all over, Stroop reported he'd captured 56,000 Jews and destroyed 631 bunkers. 631 bunkers. They were very busy in the early part of that year. He estimated that his units killed up to 7,000 Jews during the uprising. That sounds to me a bit on the high side, but that's probably because he needed to justify why it had taken them a month. And in fact, I doubt if it was ever more than 1,000 altogether of actual combat young Jews. He put the German casualties at 100. Most observers say probably much closer to 1,000. The way Stroop chose to celebrate his victory over the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto was he ordered the great synagogue on Tolmaki Street to be dynamited. And later, when Stroop was arrested after the war, excuse me, he was taped saying to a cellmate, "What a wonderful sight. I called out Heil Hitler and pressed the button. A terrific explosion brought flames right up to the clouds. The colors were unbelievable, an unforgettable allegory of the triumph over Jewry. The Warsaw Ghetto had ceased to exist because that is what Adolf Hitler and Heinrich Himmler wanted." So here's my next question. Why do we know so little about this group called the Zed ZedW in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising? They're the ones that raised the flag. They're the ones that actually bore the brunt of the first day's attack. Why does no one know about them? Well, and you can probably believe me, immediately after the revolt, arguments broke out among the resistance fighters. The Bundists tried to claim that they led the fighting, with supporting roles from the left-wing Zionists. The social Zionists claimed that they had the leading role, with supporting role from the Bundists. Both sides sidelined, demeaned, or ignored the role of the revisionist Zed ZedW. And in effect, their role was airbrushed out of history. Official accounts of the heroic struggle rarely, if at all, mention the participation of this other group. Even the illustrious historian Martin Gilbert, most of us in the room will have read something by Martin Gilbert, doesn't mention them at all. Former Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Arens wrote a book about a year ago called Flags Over the Warsaw Ghetto, The Untold Story of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, in which he claims that the major part of the fighting was done by the revisionist Zed ZedW. Now, in a sense, you could turn around and say, well, he would, wouldn't he? Because, of course, he was from the revisionist party, from the revisionist camp. But he did incredible research. Funnily enough, about 8-9 years ago, when I was working on my book called 2 Lions, 6 Officers, and 750 Mules about the Zion Mule Corps and the Jewish Legion, I did some of my research in the Jabotinsky Museum Library in Tel Aviv. And there I was, minding my own business, with piles of stuff in front of me, and I sort of peeped over the top, and there was, and I would recognize him because he's former cabinet minister, there was Moshe Arens. Now, I don't know him, he doesn't know me, but he was obviously already then working on this major opus. So the role of the Zed ZedW is unknown, firstly because so few of them survived. They were almost all wiped out. Secondly, because we know that the labor Zionists controlled the culture of Israel. They wrote the history books of Israel in its early years, and they were in a position to create monuments, research institutes, and books that told the story from their point of view. Another reason is that historians were too quick to accept the labor-leaning, left-wing Zionist narrative. And another reason is that the revisionist leaders in Palestine were much more preoccupied with the task of fighting to drive the British out and establish a Jewish state than to argue over what had happened over there in Warsaw 3 years earlier. And here's a very interesting reason that I've come up with, that Arens reluctantly comes to this conclusion as well. You see, those of you that know anything about Israeli history, in 1977, big changes happened when, for the first time, a right-wing government came into power in the modern state of Israel. And Menachim Begin became the prime minister after almost 30 years of labor-led coalitions in power. Now, you'd think that this would be a great opportunity to do a bit of counterbalancing in the narrative. Now, there was some. Jabotinsky, no one had heard of him. Suddenly we all heard of him because he appeared on the, I think it was on a 100 shekel note, or 100 lira note at the time. And all of a sudden, the name Jabotinsky, apart from it being Jabotinsky Street in every single city, but no one knew who he was. And so he got sort of rehabilitated, but not this bit about the Warsaw Ghetto. Arens hints that Begin may have downplayed the role of the revisionists in Warsaw because he had a guilty conscience, because Begin left the ghetto at the last possible minute before the war. And several people inside the ghetto and outside the ghetto had things to say about him, because he was the leader of the revisionists. So my conclusion is that the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising deserves to be free of political bias. I believe that we must acknowledge our debt to all the fighters, no matter what their political leanings. It's not a matter of who did more. It's not a matter of who was better. The Bundists, of course, they claimed that they were the leading light and everybody else followed. But again, they would say that, wouldn't they? But I do think that the fact that there was a second grouping, physically separate, no unified command, but doing something that we know was very, very effective, needs to be acknowledged. The German commander himself immediately saw the significance. He saw this flag flying as laying down the gauntlet to the Nazis. He said this is a declaration of war. And of course what it was from the Jewish point of view is, we will not go quietly, we will fight. One of the tragedies of the war and of the Holocaust is that Jewish partisans and freedom fighters, not only in Warsaw and elsewhere, always expected more help than they got from the non-Jewish underground, not just in Warsaw. They put up, these are the Jews who put up the Polish flag together with the blue and white flag, hoping, as this woman who lived right in the square, she said, this is wonderful, they're putting up our flag, good for the Jews. Most of the underground, anti-Nazi underground in Poland remained steadfastly anti-Semitic right through the war. There was no perceptible positive mass response from the surrounding larger Polish community towards the ghetto uprising. Underground newspapers of the traditionally anti-Semitic Polish nationalists maintained an openly unsympathetic attitude to the revolt. One clandestine right-wing publication concluded that the destruction of Warsaw's Jews was simply historic justice. It's not that I'm surprised by this, but it's something that we need to be aware of, that it wasn't just Jews fighting the obvious enemy. There was no one beyond willing to do much for them. Only one Polish Socialist Party organ provided a full and sympathetic account of the uprising. And if you look further afield, Britain, America, search the newspapers, search the media, precious little. Didn't merit special mention. And they knew. Believe me, they knew. So that's one of the curious and very sad elements of any Jewish resistance during the war. There was very, very little fellow feeling from the other people involved, engaged in exactly the same conflict. The Allies knew all about the deportations. They knew about the uprising. Do you know how we know that they knew? Because of Chief Rabbi Herzog, who was the chief rabbi here before he left in 1936 to become chief rabbi of the British Mandate of Palestine. Right through the war was sending urgent telegrams, I would say almost hysterical telegrams, to de Valera, stating chapter and verse where Jews were being picked up, where they were being taken. He knew as much as any intelligence. So I can assure you that if Dev knew right through the war what was happening to Jewish communities, so did the Allies, which makes the lack of any Allied action, such as bombing the railway lines to the death camps, inexcusable. Now, there is a more famous Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and that is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, August-September 1944. This was the Poles. No Jews left, so it could only be the Poles. What happened in that uprising? Well, the Allies helped Polish freedom fighters in a way that did not involve the expenditure of a single dollar or the sacrifice of a single airman's life. How? British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden stood up in the House of Commons and he said, the Allies expected all surrendering Polish freedom fighters to be treated as regular prisoners of war. Now we're talking about August, September 1944. Anyone could see which way the wind was blowing. It was a matter of time. It wasn't anymore whether Germany would lose the war, it was when Germany would lose the war. So standing up in Parliament and saying to the Germans, you treat anyone you capture in Warsaw as a prisoner of war, otherwise you'll be treated as war criminals, he didn't have to spell it out, was a very powerful message, a very unmistakable warning to the Nazis. But of course, that warning was reserved for Warsaw's Gentile population because the Jews had all been murdered anyway. My friends, I started this talk by describing how a young Polish Jewish refugee, my dad, escaped from Berlin to Scotland with a kinder transport and then fought in the war against the Nazis. Somewhere between the last Red Cross telegram he received from the Lodz ghetto in 1942 and the end of the war, his parents, grandparents, uncles, aunts and cousins were murdered. To this day, he doesn't know where, when or how his parents and family were killed. Yesterday, Tommy Raconteur, our very celebrated Holocaust survivor who has made it his personal mission in life, I think, to try and inform every single resident in Ireland about what happened to him. I think he's already well past the 50,000 mark in terms of the number of people he has told, addressed us yesterday to commemorate Holocaust Memorial Day, Yom HaShoah. And he said that the Holocaust lasted from 1939 to 1945. Actually, I beg to differ. Because in 1946, 15 months after the end of the war, two of my father's uncles who had managed to survive the concentration camps, got through them, got to displaced persons camps and were allowed to go home to Poland, to their homes in Kielce, were murdered in Kielce, in the Kielce pogrom, with 50 other Jews. So the Holocaust did not end when the war ended. When my father and mother married in December 44, they made a vow that they would rebuild the Fachler tribe that had been decimated in the Holocaust. Every time I give this statistic, I have to change the numbers. At the last count, my parents had brought into the world 7 children, 26 grandchildren, including several Israeli army officers, and over 80 great-grandchildren. And that was today. By tomorrow, it might change. Twins born a couple of weeks ago, and all of them proud Jews, all of them mindful of the gap they are filling, all of them mindful of the brave fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto who showed that Jews will fight for their right to live. On a hot night of the 3rd of August 1942, in the heart of the Warsaw Ghetto, 19-year-old David Grava signed his name on a piece of paper and put it inside a metal box. He knew he might have only minutes to live because German soldiers had arrived in the next street. This was in the heart of the time when so many people were being deported and murdered. 2 weeks earlier, most of the ghetto's residents had been taken to Treblinka, and it really was just a matter of time. If the formation of the Jewish militias that we spoke about earlier was an obvious form of resistance, David was involved in another form of resistance, a colossal, secret attempt to record every detail of ghetto life in an archive. And the code name for this project was Oyneg Shabbos. Oyneg Shabbos meaning, that's the Yiddish way of saying the joy of the Sabbath. Tens of thousands of documents were written and hidden in metal boxes. I said earlier, only a handful of the people in the ghetto survived, and only a handful of the contributors to Oyneg Shabbos survived. But in September 1946, after weeks of planning and calculating, and don't forget, the place has been razed now, you can't recognize anything, they estimated where they thought the hiding place must have been. They dug beneath the rubble, and they found many of the boxes. Not all, but many of the boxes. And this is what David wrote on that August day. I would love to see the moment in which this great treasure will be dug up and scream the truth at the world. May the treasure fall into good hands. May it last into better times. May it alarm and alert the world to what happened in the 20th century. May history be our witness. In 11 days' time, to mark the 70th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, an incredible museum is opening in Warsaw. It's called the Museum of the History of Polish Jews in the ghetto, on where the ghetto stood. It's, I've seen, you can go onto YouTube and see some of the way in which this has been built. It is quite amazing, visually stunning, and just from looking at what they're doing, you can get such a sense of what it is they are commemorating. Now, it's not specifically about the Warsaw Uprising, but of course, the location they've chosen is the Warsaw Ghetto. They've reconstructed a wooden synagogue only using the same implements that we used to build the original synagogue, with all the same plans. And that is right there in the center of this museum. A little late, but very welcome, in my opinion. Today, all over Israel, sirens sounded for Yom HaShoah. People stood in silence to pay homage, as we did, to the 6 million Jewish men, women, and children murdered by the Nazis. And they remembered the bravery of the Warsaw Ghetto fighters and their nerve in raising the blue and white flag over the ghetto. Now, I wrote this 2 or 3 days ago, and today someone communicated to me that today, I think, the Prime Minister of Israel, Bibi Netanyahu, made specific mention of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising as part of this year's Yom HaShoah. And I couldn't help being reminded of another occasion when the blue and white flag flew over Poland, literally. Israeli Brigadier General Amir Eshel's grandmother perished in Auschwitz. 10 years ago, he flew his F-15 fighter jet with its blue and white emblem proudly painted on the underside of the wings over the death camp. And Eshel was joined by 2 other Israeli jets, also piloted by descendants of Holocaust survivors. It was impossible not to think of the thousands of Allied bombers that flew that same route, but knowingly failed to bomb the gas chambers and the crematoria. And as the Israeli jets with their blue and white flags flew over Auschwitz, Amir Eshel broadcast a message. The Israeli Air Force salutes the courage of the Holocaust victims and promises to be the shield of the Jewish people and its nation Israel. David Grava, in his last note written in the Warsaw Ghetto, he asked for better times. And the following year, his colleagues in the ghetto rose up against the Nazi beast and flew the blue and white flag over the Warsaw Ghetto. Tonight, we salute them. Thank you.